Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Arnold, Director of Artistic Planning and Orchestral Operations for the Richmond Symphony, and I'm your host for today's session, Opus 2021 Orchestrating Change. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Michelle Miller-Burns, President and CEO of the Minnesota Orchestra, Matías Tarnopolsky, President and CEO of the Philadelphia Orchestra Association, and Deborah Borda, President and CEO of the New York Philharmonic. Welcome. Today's session will focus on three topics that have been on the top of my mind within the orchestral industry: the Black Lives Matter movement, redefining artistic excellence, and finally, orchestra personnel and work culture. One of the highlights of SphinxConnect is the Q&A portion of these discussions. Please check out the chat bar on the side, and we will save plenty of time at the end for questions from our audience. So let's begin. We saw many statements from orchestras after George Floyd's murder about how Black lives matter. What are ways that your institution is working within your community to support social justice and progress? And that's for everyone. But Michelle, I'm going to start with you since George Floyd's murder was in Minneapolis and the start of the protest.
Thanks so much, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here today. And yeah, I would like to speak about George Floyd's killing, which took place here in Minneapolis on May 25th of 2020, and the response that we formulated as an organization to his killing. Obviously, there was a real spotlight here in the Twin Cities at that time, and we put a lot of thought into how we would respond. What would we communicate as an organization connected to the community here? And so we did several things. So I'll just kind of highlight a few of those. First, we thought, how do we lead? What do we do first? And so we decided leading with music felt like the right thing to do. We are a musical organization, so let's go to that. Let's use our mission to guide us. And so we developed and recorded a video, which was a string quartet performing the Largo movement of Shostakovich String Quartet number 8. We had an overlay of photos from George Floyd's memorial site and also from the protests. And we released that on social media and then posted it on our website, and it is still there today. We closed the video with a slide that read, "Rest in Power." And I'd like to just address that for a second. This was, this is a journey, and people come along in that journey at a different pace and in different ways. And part of our role as leaders in organizations is to really keep everybody on that journey, on that path together. And so this was an example where a couple of our supporters came to me and expressed concern that we had used the rest in power terminology. And they thought perhaps that was inflammatory, and why couldn't we say rest in peace? And rest in peace, as we know, would not have been appropriate. It wasn't peaceful. And so what I learned is that those supporters were thinking about the institution, thinking about their own experience. And when I shared with them some definitions, like to really explained what that terminology meant, then they, had a completely different reaction, a sense of understanding, agreeing that it was an appropriate and powerful message, and pleased that we had used that message. And so this is just part of that kind of ongoing education and drawing in that as leaders in an organization, we get to do on this journey. We also had an organization-wide convening with musicians, staff members, and board just in the week after George Floyd's killing, an opportunity to get together, to have some good discussions, and to really pose the question, how might our orchestra use our position in the community to affect change? And the responses that came from that have really informed a lot of the work that we have done since that time. And then finally, in the month of August, we had a series of outdoor concerts, and a community organizer that we have, whom we have worked with in the past many times, came to us, and she said, what else are you doing to respond to George Floyd's killing? And she said, people are really looking to see what the orchestra is doing. And she suggested that we do several things. One, recognize what's happening. Make sure that we demonstrate we understand what's happening in our community. Show that we have existing relationships, that we aren't, just kind of here in our own bubble. And then demonstrate that we're not going to be silent. And she had a very specific suggestion, which we took to heart and put into place, which was having a member of a leader from the Black community introduce a work of a composer of color on each of our programs in August. We were had already planned that programming, but she said, why don't you have, draw the community into this work and have a leader make that introduction at those concerts. And that ended up being a really powerful tool and just a really positive experience for our audiences and for our musicians and for the organization and community. I'll pause there. There's much more I can say about the internal, what we're doing internally and externally, but I'll give that a moment in case someone else would like to jump in.
Thanks, Michelle.
I was thinking that's what you did was, I was actually for how in some ways slow and backwards our entire, the symphonic world has been. I think a moment when organizations step forward very proactively. I was proud of what many orchestras did, and that's terrific as you've described it. And we did many things like that. I'd like to come at it though from a slightly different angle, which is it was absolutely critical to respond, but I think when we think about change, we have to think about ourselves. We have to think about how our institutions and the people within them and what we do and how we work, how that has to change. And so for us, the murder of George Floyd was an opportunity to really create much more of a strategic alignment, I think, within the institution and to inculcate a commitment to this is work that we have to, that is long-term work. It's work about learning. It's about many different things, because I think it's very important that this doesn't, that we don't do certain, we take all the right actions, but then that's it, because it has to be taken into the DNA of the organization. So I think for us, one of the things that was really just terrific coming out of this was that, and maybe this will sound sort of backwards that we hadn't done it before, but we created a cross-institutional task force with musicians, with board, and with staff. It is led by the chairman of our board, which I think is really very important. And the kind of discussion that took place within that is how I think we can actually learn together and move the organization ahead. We hired a terrific consultant who also helped us, because we really had to present and have people participate in anti-racist training. Very important to do that. And I feel like this provided the basis, and we've spent time doing that now that we were able to spin it off. And I'm going to let somebody else talk, and how it affected our collaborations with our summer programs and Bandwagon, and how we're intentionally moving forward on it. But so for me, as what a remarkable, sadness for us to think about this, but for us to think about how we can use the horror of it to change. And that's the other point I just wanted to make. But great, all the things that you did, and great the things that other orchestras did as well.
I'd like to, first of all, thank Jen for, thank Jen for kicking us off with this, and having Michelle lead it there, having, being deep in your community. And I, listening to both Michelle and Deborah talk about it is an opportunity for me to reflect on that moment. And the conversations that happened that day between me and our music director, musicians in the orchestra, board and staff, and it was a warm weekend day here. We were at that stage almost a year into a very deep, multi-layered process of bringing together the organization around the issue of ideas, inclusion, diversity, equity, and access strategies. A now common acronym, but not so common then. And very committed to doing this in what we're calling in a culturally integrated way. So I think, Deborah, you might have used the word DNA, so that it really was part of the DNA of the organization. The first thing that happened, you know, when part of the Band-Aid was ripped off by COVID, then what we've been calling the public execution of George Floyd sort of ripped off the Band-Aid completely and made us think that if, as cultural institutions, we're going to be part of rebuilding our society on the other side of COVID, just as important is helping create a new society in light of the far greater visibility of a searing issue that's been there all along, that of racism in today we're talking about classical music, but it's everywhere in society. It's searingly public in a way that it hasn't been in recent times too. So when we were thinking that day about the statement, we really wanted to orient it around music. And I mean, there was beauty in these moments as well. I mean, it was an appalling tragedy, but there was beauty in looking for the words, beauty in seeking meaning. We were meant to have a gala within a couple of weeks. We postponed that and instead had a program. This was all online, of course, a program that we called Here Together, that was a live public program hosted by our music director and I with guests, with Valerie Coleman, the composer, who'd already at that stage written an anthem, which was incredibly prescient for that moment. We're calling it an anthem it's called 7 o'clock shout, but an anthem for that, for the orchestra. We had a double bassist in our orchestra, Joe Conyers, who's been very, very active in both music education and in the realm of inclusion. And we had Wynton Marsalis join us. I tell you these names because they're powerful actors as we think about this, this subject. And all three of them gave us something more to think about, gave us more words, more language, and opened new doors into this subject and how we could respond. And that response continued for us in many, many ways, and I'm sure we'll come to them later in the session. For me, the most important was that the process is ongoing, and that we appointed a VP for ideas, somebody at the senior level of the management, and her name is Doris Parent. She's listening on this panel, and she's been just invaluable in helping the organization think about ideas, both historically and much more importantly going forward. So I do want to give a shout out to Doris, who's been fundamental in leading this charge through the Philadelphia Orchestra.
Thank you. So I will say that here in Richmond, at that time, we're not in session because we don't have a summer season here. So there were very few of us in office because it was the height of COVID. But I was here, and those of us that were in office, I think the first thing we did was take time to reflect and pause and listen to our community, and kind of share in the moment. And I feel like, I mean, I grieved, but we paused everything via social media. We drew up a plan. We wanted to tell the community, what are we doing now? And how do we want to move forward? And how can we support? So we drew up a plan, put it on our website, and then we just shared the stories of the community. And here in Richmond, we of course were the capital of the Confederacy, so there's a rich history here. And I will say that there was a call, not a call, there were a lot of emails around that time, because along with the protests that were happening, the Elijah McClain violin vigils were happening. And so there was, we were receiving emails and calls and people in the community being like, can the Richmond Symphony participate? But we were on the off season. So I'm a doer. And I was like, we can do that and we should do that. So the staff that was in the office, we just joined together in 4 days and we planned a visual for Elijah McLean that I led. And Richmond Symphony musicians came. We safely were able to do it, and the community came. And it was at the former Robert E. Lee statue. That is very, they're currently trying to remove. But it's also called has been reclaimed as the Marcus David Peters Square for another victim of police violence. And so it was really a time for this community to come together. And a lot of people use the word healing. I don't think we're there yet, but to grieve and to express their emotions in whatever way they needed to. And I agree with Michelle. I mean, the music, some people say music is not enough, but for some people it is enough. And that's what they need. They need that moment to reflect and to grieve. Okay, so I wanted to tie in a little bit to what Deborah was saying about the committee that you came up with, the group, and talk about artistic excellence. So all of your orchestras are widely recognized as leaders of artistic excellence, but often in this industry, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, or IDEA goals, are discussed and planned separately from the artistic goals of the institution. So my first question is, should that even happen? Should they maybe merge? I've been thinking about this a lot because I I head up the Artistic Excellence Committee, and someone in my organization runs the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee. Should they be together? Should we start talking about this in a different way and thinking about this a different way? So Matías, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Jen. First thing to say is you can't be excellent without being diverse, and you can't be diverse without being excellent. So diversity is excellence. Excellence is diversity. For us, like the New York Philharmonic, like Deborah, we've had this board member, musician, staff member committee that's been powerfully operational since August of 2019, and doing fantastic work. We have a music director and an artistic department keenly connected with questions of diversity, equity, and access, artistic and education and community department. And the task force, the ideas task force, is involved in helping us make sure that the programming that we're putting on the stage is diverse, and also helping us calibrate, how's the community going to respond to this? And there've been several occasions where we've actually debated certain programmatic choices with that group to make sure that what we think is a gesture for in favor of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion indeed is not just indeed is going to be read as, but indeed is a really sincere gesture. And that group has been absolutely invaluable in terms of helping us understand what we're doing. And then when we do something, making sure that the language that we use to package it, to present it, to talk about it, means the right thing. So, I'll give an example. On our opening night, there was a big debate about whether or not to perform the national anthem. And we decided not to, and instead decided to perform My Country, 'Tis of Thee. And we had a big debate about that because the language is problematic there. And the creative impetus that came from all this debate, including the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access Task Force, was an idea that was very much of the moment, which was to begin with Marian Anderson singing My Country, 'Tis of Thee, the film of it at the Lincoln Memorial. That performance was meant to take place in Philadelphia and didn't. And then we went from that to a sort of faded out of that and faded into Angel Blue, the Philadelphia Orchestra, and Yannick Nézet-Séguin singing the rest of My Country, 'Tis of Thee, including a lot of narrative around the fact that Marian Anderson used the words of the we sing rather than of the I sing. That's just one example of many where the sort of artistic impetus and the commitment, this sort of, as I've said before, this culturally integrated commitment to ideas are working absolutely in concert. And that's our example of, diversity equals excellence. Excellence is diversity.
If I could jump in here with some additional thoughts around the how the DEI work and goals are aligned and integrated with artistic programming. We too have a collaborative committee taking a focus on DEI work. It's been in place since 2016, and we're currently working with Justin Lang of Halambo LLC as our guide in this process, and grateful for his partnership with us. So a lot of a lot of thinking has gone into DEI and now a focus on anti-racism within the Minnesota Orchestra. So we've really taken that broad DEI focus and taken a look at it specifically related to anti-racism. And so I do feel like our artistic programming goals and our anti-racism work are coming together. They're evolving. And I'll share with you why I say evolving. Because a year ago, when we were ready to announce our 2021 season, we took that step back, took a look at the repertoire for the season and realized there was only one work by what we are calling an Amelia composer, and that is an acronym that means African, Middle Eastern, Latin, Indigenous, and Asian. So it's something that we have kind of constructed ourselves and we're using internally, so Amelia. Only one Amelia composer's work was on the season schedule. Can you imagine that today? But even a year ago, that was the case. And so we knew that was not right, problematic, absolutely, and quickly added several more works prior to announcing the season schedule. Is that enough? No. Does it show intent? No, it showed that we were kind of on the back end of that process. But I feel like the work that this organization has done collaboratively, musician, staff, board members coming together with Justin's guidance and partnership, and George Floyd's killing has really been a catalyst for accelerating this work and this thinking. And so by the time we got to August, and I mentioned that we had a series of outdoor concerts in August, each of which featured at least one work by an Amelia composer. As a leader in the organization, I was not in a position to needing to push for that to happen. That happened because our musicians said, this must happen. And I want to give a shout out to our Musicians Artistic Advisory Committee, some of whom I imagine are probably joining us today, because they put a lot of thought and work into this. This isn't something that you just decide to do and then put some works on a program, but it's something that you research. You really do a deep dive. You find, as they have, found recordings online and used existing databases. They have now created a database within the Minnesota Orchestra of works that they have heard, that they have been exposed to, that they embrace and want to share with the orchestra, with fellow musicians, and with our audiences. So I'm just really pleased to see this evolution within our organization and the coming together of our DEI and anti-racism priorities with artistic programming.
I love the term Amelia. It's a beautiful word. It's really a beautiful word. And, so much, I just want to thank Michelle and Matías, because yes, diversity is excellence and excellence is diversity. I mean, I think those of us who think about this know that we need to find a way not to just stay by the old canon, because we need to expand it for a vibrant future. And I think bringing the kind of intentionality now, but an intentionality that is thoughtful, that aligns goals. I mean, that really will make a difference. So in New York, we were being at the beginning when this all kicked off last March or April, we were absolutely the epicenter of, there's so many people dying every day. From my apartment in New York, it was just nonstop sirens, and it was just very difficult. And we were not allowed to gather people even for, remote sessions or anything. But finally, by the summer, things had sort of started to loosen up a little, and we thought, what can we do? Because I mean, the isolation that our musicians and the stress that they were under just from being isolated and not being able to play, the staff working remotely, COVID, the murder of George Floyd, everything that was happening, the upcoming election, it was as stressful in a time emotionally as there was. So we thought, okay, and this was a little name that we gave. We thought, if people can't come to the music, we'll bring music to the people. So we launched a program called Bandwagon. We got a truck and we drove it around the city, and we went to every borough. We didn't go any place where you would expect us to go. We went to every borough. We did 81 concerts. But as part of doing that, first of all, we made community collaborations. We reached out to people. These are relationships that are now developing and going to move forward into the future as eventually we open our new hall. And that also helps us as we think about is intentionally, this is just part, this is now natural for every single, and Bandwagon was divided into different weekends, and we do a different program, week actually, and each week we do a different program. For every week, we commissioned a world premiere from, and I guess you'd say Amelia or BIPOC or whatever, who came along with us on the Bandwagon, who introduced the piece. And the musicians love, and they were tremendous pieces. In fact, we're recording some of them now for our streaming series. So what I'm trying to say is, I think, Michelle, you described it so beautifully, and Matías, and you've done a lot of, you dove your organization into this sooner in a very thoughtful way. But as this becomes mindful, intentional, and natural as a positive thing, I don't think we have to, Jen, I don't know that we have to have that debate. Is it about excellence? Of course it is. This makes us more excellent. And if we don't think about how we not only think about that, but also think about gender and diversity in many different ways, this is an important moment. And at the end of everything that's happened between the murder of George Floyd and COVID, if we can't look back and say, and ask the question, how were we changed? In the Messiah, it always says, and we shall all be changed. We had better be. And I think this is, again, it was an opportunity to start to do that kind of work in alignment and with real passion.
I think Deborah brings up something so important there. And I have to say, it's wonderful to hear Michelle and Deborah and you, Jen, talk about your own experiences and hearing how other organizations, there's a sense that one size doesn't fit all, but there's great courage in what I'm hearing. But the theme that's coming through for me is the essential need for collaboration. The way one of the series we launched is called Our City, Your Orchestra, and that really is about collaborating with Black-owned businesses and the civic organizations such as Black-owned businesses such as Harriet's Bookshop, which is a wonderful recently created institution in our city, and the Marian Anderson Museum to keep the Marian Anderson theme, but also for all of us, of course, Sphinx, New Music USA's Amplifying Voices is doing fantastic. It is a fantastic initiative that we can all take part in, where you have Sphinx and the Sphinx Ventures Fund and New Music USA's Amplifying Voices there. I declare an interest because I'm on the board of New Music USA, but it's a scheme that I'm very, very proud of the organization to be doing. So this idea of this essential need to collaborate is, for me, more important than ever, and has been the most enriching for the organization, and I think for the community as well, because it really is a two-way street.
Thank you. So I really want to talk, I live in the audition orchestra personnel space. I love to talk about how we get more players on stage that are Black and brown. So my first question is, as auditions are paused and contracts are being renegotiated due to the COVID-19 crisis, what changes are being made within your organization to address bias and inequity in the areas of audition and tenure? And if, no, let's just start there and I'll ask my next question later. Deborah, would you like to go first, or Michelle? Michelle.
I just was taking a look. I understand that there was a question about Amelia, so I thought I would just clarify that, what that stands for. That was the question. It stands for African, Middle Eastern, Latin, Indigenous, and Asian. And while I am talking, I will continue with your question, Jen. You know, to say very candidly, I think we're earlier perhaps in this process with, you know, changes that we might make in the, you know, audition and tenure process than perhaps Matías or Deborah may have some more kind of meat to put on the bone here. But I'll just start by saying that the National Alliance for Audition Support is a really valuable forum. We have found that to be true. Minnesota is one of 92 NAS partner orchestras, and my colleague Beth Keller-Long is on the NAS Orchestra Advisory Committee. So I just wanted to express some gratitude in this session to NAS and to the subcommittee, who really put a lot of thought into these audition and tenure guidelines. And you know, we know that it isn't a one size fits all in anything in an organization. So we have to be able to craft it and apply it appropriately and to its best effort into our own organizations. But I think it's really helpful to have had such a broad set of constituencies take a look at this issue and make some guidelines. I think of it as a really wonderful tool. It's a way to open up a conversation or accelerate a conversation maybe that's already taking place. And I know that the Sphinx Orchestral Partner auditions are also something I just wanted to make note of in this session, that again, a really valuable resource for orchestras. And just a little side note that after the 2019 SOPA auditions, we, within 2 weeks after those auditions, engaged a violist to play a subscription program with us. And that musician colleague has been back multiple times for orchestral performance with the Minnesota Orchestra since then. And I know that we have 14 musician representatives who are going to be participating, you know, listening to those auditions coming up this year as well. So in terms of this work, we are in that process, and we are grateful to have these guidelines as a tool, as a discussion opener or continuation.
I think for me, the most important part of the question is we are in this time of contracts are open, or some people's contracts are open or up to negotiation because, you know, COVID. So I'm thinking, especially for how do those changes within these contracts that are coming up within, I mean, being negotiated maybe in the next year or two or now, recognize systemic racism as it pertains specifically to a deficit of Black players in post-protest. So Matías, I'm gonna pass that to you.
Thank you. Wonderful to hear what's Minnesota's doing. I talked about the process that we've been going through with this ideas task force, and I want to also credit the consultant team we've been working with, which is a group called Accordant Advisors, and especially their principal, Shark Yousafzai, who has been really part of us since we began this process with them in early to mid 2019. But the Philadelphia Orchestra, though things have accelerated in this realm recently, we've had players decades long in the orchestra, such as Gloria de Pasquale, who's been involved with the league, fantastic cellist in the orchestra, and has been a passionate, invaluable advocate for better inclusion throughout our organization, especially better inclusion, diversity, equity, and access throughout our organization, especially on the stage. And in the summer of 2019, our music director and some members of the orchestra started talking about how can we make sure that our audition process is more equitable. If it were equitable, there would be more, the orchestra would be more diverse. And so, the fact that this commitment begins with the music director is so important to us, but it's equally passionately felt by the members committee and the artistic advisory committee, who formulate collaboratively the audition process. And so while often in our field we default to the structures, we need to negotiate this as part of collective bargaining, there is so much work that can happen before then, right? That can help create a more equitable, let's call it, audition process, keeping in mind diversity is excellence, excellence is diversity. Like Minnesota, a large group of our orchestra is going to be part of SOPA as well. What I can say today is that there is deep commitment and there's a lot of conversation about what the next chapter of the audition process is. I really do want to be very respectful to my colleagues in the orchestra who are having these conversations now. And I think we'll begin to see changes soon that will hopefully yield results.
Well, this is a whole fascinating world we're trading in right now when we start to talk about negotiations. I think I've heard it characterized, and I think it's unfortunate actually, that as many of our organizations have either had to negotiate short-term labor agreements, or for us, we've just negotiated a really stunningly different four-year contract. But what has bothered me in the discussion is the use of, people talking about the leverage that the managements and the boards have now because of the financial disaster, that disaster zone that all of us are facing as we can't sell a ticket. And so as we negotiated this contract, we thought a lot, and I have to say again, all credit to our musicians, that there were, and I'm going to come back to auditions, Jen, because I know you want to talk about this, but we were able to really have such great discussions and make changes to the contract that allows for a much greater flexibility in terms of the kind of community work we need to do, the kind of collaborations, which are so important, that we have to do the kind of educational work that we owe to the outside world. So, but this was in the midst of a very, it was not an angry negotiation, but we lost an additional like $15 million last year, but it was a sad negotiation because we needed to come to a place where there was a pathway for recovery for the orchestra. And not knowing, I'm not even sure we'll be able to play in September. Depends what happens with the variants that are coming out. And so we made a very conscious decision. And I hope you won't see this as backtracking. I saw it as a way to move to a greater commitment, to take the discussion, which everybody knew that we had to have and want to have, about auditions and how we achieve something on the stage that looks even vaguely like our community, and to take it outside of the very difficult moment of the negotiations we were doing, that we did, and that we accomplished in peace and together. And so we have a special committee now from the orchestra that is looking at, working together. We're working together with them on just that. It's completely, the board is completely supportive. I think, the orchestra has to work their way through this. This is a change for how orchestras have done their business over the years. And I think it's going to be a good change. But I just wanted to make that point that I thought it was very important to pursue this in a serious way and with open hearts. That was why we agreed to do it separately from the negotiations, and the negotiations are done. And then in terms of the NAS guideline, the very thoughtful document that's come out, I just saw it the other day for the first time. I mean, I think this is going to be a great point of, a point of discussion that it would be very useful in that way. I think, Michelle, you said one size doesn't fit all. So for example, I saw that, one of the things we talked about was, every single person should be able to come for a live audition. We have like 300, when we have an opening, I'm sure you have this at your orchestras as well, we'll get 300 people who will apply. So we've got to, so it's a great idea, but we have to think about how we actualize it. And so I come back to this thought of, how do we actualize? How do we make a difference? What are the ways that we don't just put window dressing up, but we actually get to a point where we put programs in place so we have diversity on the stage as well as just talking about it?
Thank you. So for me, we have not reopened a contract here in Richmond. We've been playing, thankfully, safely all year, all season. But it has been something on my mind because our contract does expire in a couple of years, next year, I think. And audition fairness is at the top of my mind. So like the National Alliance of Audition Support did come up with these guidelines. And if anyone out there wants to see them, they should be in the hyperlink underneath. But one thing I think that is really prevalent amongst Black and Brown players in the industry is that the intentional hire comes up, or restorative hiring, places that are owed to people because of systemic racism, right? And so I'm interested if, granted, I think you said you're early in the process, so maybe we shouldn't even deep dive into this, but I'm interested if those kind of conversations are coming up, like real actual movement conversations that make a difference and will affect change, or if it's just too early and 5 years from now and it's pie in the sky.
I'll jump in. It's a really good question. To me, this process right now of alignment and of working together, because it is early, is really important. And what is critical is that organizations come to the right place themselves, and we don't we don't impose it. And you have to do this in the auditions. It's not going to work that way. I think there are other creative ways to think about it almost immediately. To give people an opportunity right away. Before I start talking about this, I'm actually going to edit myself right now and stop, because this is a process we have to do together with our musicians.
So the concept of restorative hiring is actually relatively new to me, and it hadn't come up until in our ideas process, and I think it's actually for good reason it hadn't come up. As I said before, what Shark and Accordant advisors have taught us is really that to be successful, there has to be a sort of culturally integrated change in the organization, right? That the commitment to ideas is throughout. And restorative hiring is about metrics-driven totemic, these are Accordance terms, metric-driven or totemic change. That doesn't stay with you. That's not foundational. What I described in my earlier answer, the types of conversations that are happening, the really important advocates within the orchestra, in positions of authority in the orchestra, in members committee and artistic advisory committee, the deep commitment of our music director, and the need to do the right thing will yield, I'm confident that it's going to yield a more inclusive and diverse and equitable group of people on the stage making music, composers, conductors, soloists, everybody who plays a part. But I think it's almost, I'm going to say something a bit provocative. It's a little easy to say, oh, we should just engage in restorative hiring. What I've read about it, which, as I say, it's only recent, is not it's not connected to that deep DNA type change.
Jen, I'll just add that on the staff side, that's something we're grappling with here at the Minnesota Orchestra right now, is how do our employment decisions and considerations really align with and reflect our DEI and anti-racist guiding principles. And we've established a set of guiding principles here that we are calling upon as we make decisions as an organization on a going forward basis. So I just wanted to kind of add that this is something really important as it is carried out and reflected on stage. And we also have to ensure that our DEI and anti-racist work is being reflected in our employment decisions on the staff as well.
Okay.
And I would add on the board as well. I mean, it is these organizations, although they are guided by our musicians, our board, our staff. And you need to think, you really need to have active programs in all three, because one alone will not, it's got to be all of the above.
Yeah, like so much of this conversation, I am in enormous agreement with my colleagues.
So every question, it's the Q&A moment, and every question coming through is about personnel and hiring. I'm going to read this one. It's a question related to the NAS guidelines. Why are so many orchestra managements and music directors resistant to keeping screens up for all rounds? It sounds like nobody has embraced those NAS guidelines. And I just want to say, that's a great question. A couple years ago, when I was still in the Oregon Symphony viola section, I was on the ICSOM diversity committee that talked about this and came away with a recommendation like at least 5 years ago, I would think, about this exactly. All 3 rounds or 4 rounds with screen. So the question from the audience is, why are so many orchestra managements and music directors resistant?
I'm happy to jump in. I don't know there's resistance. I mean, I think that's one answer, but it's not the only answer. And I think what we've all been saying is that this is a journey. We're now talking about the hardest aspect of it, the audition process. And sometimes the blind audition process does work, and sometimes it doesn't. But I don't think it's necessarily due to resistance. I don't see resistance. I see openness to making things better from where I'm sitting at the Philadelphia Orchestra. I don't see resistance. But sorry, let me be clear. But I don't see that as necessarily the answer either. I don't know.
Okay.
Can I just say, I don't know if you saw about a couple of months ago, New York Times ran an enormous think piece on this by Tony Tomasini. And what was fascinating was, because he interviewed me for it, and he interviewed many people here. And in talking with him, and some of this made it into the article, even for players of color, there are differing opinions on this, very different opinions. And I mean, another area that you could think about is, one of the areas that was considered as a forward-looking kind of way of auditions was to actually, if somebody, played that, once they seemed like the person that was going to be picked, to have them come in and work with the orchestra and find out, what kind of a human being were they? Did it work with the orchestra? And I mean, I now think, by the way, in the NAS guidelines, I really just looked at them the other day because they just came out. So, and now I can see people are calling that into question. I'm not arguing about that, but this is, as Matías said, this is going to be a real sea change, and we got to do it the right way. And I'm not sure it's actually resistance to the screens. It's more, so we've really, this is an area, got to work through it.
Okay. One question that popped up: are musicians feel that blind auditions are culturally fair, that they eliminate race and gender bias? How have orchestras worked with that pushback from contract players? I can answer that.
I think you're seeing puzzled looks from the three of us. So
I know,
maybe
right?
you can help us with the question.
Yeah, I can help with that. So I actually have this conversation a lot because I do think this industry needs to have an honest conversation about how people get jobs in this country. So I do think a lot of orchestra musicians think that that blind auditions do work and that auditions are fully blind. We hear people say it all the time. The process works, blind auditions work. But then you question them how they got their audition or how they won their job. Or then you question how their process is and read their contracts and you realize most orchestras don't have fully blind processes. So you have to have that honest conversation, I think. I'm going through a lot of contracts now because I'm interested in it and I want to see what we can improve here in Richmond. We have a really decent audition process here, but they can always be improved. And I don't even know if we should be playing the same type of music anymore all the time. There are certain pieces that should be rethought. American music should be included more, in my opinion. And if you talk about American music and auditions, Black music, Black composers and Latinx have to be included. So that's a whole other discussion. But I really feel that we need to have an honest discussion about fairness and what is really happening in the blind audition process. Often, this is why I actually enjoyed the NAS document. I just saw it the other day, but I think it addresses a lot of those things. It addresses the pre-advancement issue in our industry that often the largest orchestras have, inviting people to semifinals, inviting people to finals, unscreened finals. It's much easier to win a job when you're facing 3 to 6 people or 8 people as opposed to 100 or 200. So often Black and brown people are not pre-advanced. So I think the whole industry needs to have a discussion about how are we going to change this, like really, and how are people getting their jobs? I would also add that one of my favorite things to talk about is recruitment. We recruit for, especially as a string player, we recruit for wins often from other orchestras. We'll invite someone, but that doesn't happen as much in strings unless it's a principal player. But there are players, like, great example was me. I was in the Oregon Symphony. It would have been interesting if an orchestra would like to diversify their orchestra, if a higher, bigger budgeted orchestra would start going to these orchestras and saying, hey, Jen, would you like to come and audition for our orchestra? Whether they pre-advance me or not, maybe I would come because there's an interest there. So there are different ways to look at this, but I think it's just starting about having an honest conversation in our industry about it.
No, I think though, many people are doing this. I mean, that is an assignment that our personnel manager has to specifically to do that. And I would bet you would find that at many other, I can't speak for other, well, I've only worked at a couple, but yes, that was, something that you really think about, and also for staff and certainly for board. And I know we're just talking about auditions now, but I thought Michelle's point was good. It's got to be the totality of the organization.
Yeah, and I agree. I think actually we do better in the industry with staff and trying to recruit staff better, I say. But yeah, I agree. So there's a couple more questions. I think there was a question about, there's a lot of questions, I apologize. Okay. AFA has brought 2021 American notion of no unity without accountability very poignantly into the conference. How do orchestras begin the process of accountability before we can claim to be champions or leaders in the overdue change process? I can also
pick one of us.
Oh, sure. Matías, go ahead.
I didn't say that so you'd pick me. We've said already during this session that one size doesn't fit all. let's just unpack that a bit, because I think it goes in part to answer Afa's question. And I want to thank Afa not just for her just remarkable work in the field, but also for being a featured guest on our one of our very early Here Together podcast, and made some very important points. I think that the fact that certainly the institutions represented here, but I know throughout the field too, there is a great need for much more public accountability in the realm of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And I think what you've seen in this conversation with the four of us is various ways into it, from different perspectives of different people in 4 different organizations. And it is a fundamentally important process and journey. And I think when I look at Philadelphia, I look how accountable we are to each other within the organization and to the community. We have not been silent, we have not been still, and this is part of our everyday work. And I can tell you, a couple of years ago it wasn't. Now it is. It's already an enormous change.
Okay, go ahead, Michelle, if you want to speak on that.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Matías said about being accountability really begins within the organization. As we are learning, we need to be accountable to each other before I think we can be really fully accountable outside of the organization, before our voice can be full and fully credible in the community. So I think it starts from within. And I think some of that is about really in this process, embracing disequilibrium and embracing discomfort, and really understanding how that can really help move a process and our thinking forward. And then also to be mindful of when it gets too much out of balance and it impedes progress. So that's something that I think we grapple with a little bit as well. But that accountability begins within.
Okay, our last question, I think we covered some of the ones that came out. Could someone discuss how orchestras grapple with the reality that an undeniable reality that the classical music world is canonization? Sorry, let me read that again. Could you discuss how orchestras grapple with the reality that an undeniable reality of the classical music world is canonization? How are you making adequate room for change while maintaining the musical canon in a way that is not tokenism?
Well, I'll give you an example. And we use of course, it was just 100 years ago that women in America, only white women, got the right to vote through the 19th passage of the 19th Amendment. So a way that we found that we thought we could not only recognize that, but really, because I think less than 2% of the music presented on stage has been written by women, and this is changing. And so we started a project called Project 19, where we commissioned 19 women, many of color, a very diverse group of women, and tried to make a very specific statement through doing that. And that was just, direct action that we could take. And that's an example of where you can actually, move the thermometer.
And I will add just a short thing, because before we close out, that for me as an artistic planner, I'm having new conversations with managers about their rosters, what the soloists play. Not only, I ask, number one, do you have a person of color on your roster? And if you don't, do your artists, are they learning works by people of color? I ask managers that all the time. And that's a new conversation that a lot of people are having. But that's a way that, if we schedule a Tchaikovsky violin concerto here, you better believe we're going to have probably a Black or brown soloist play it. So that's a way to keep the canon, but also highlight people of color. Okay, so we're going to close out. I want to thank our guests today. Thank you so much for an engaging conversation. And I want to just leave with this one last question for everyone. How do we want to be remembered during this time and beyond? And one action item for the audience to take away into the world. I'll start with you, Michelle.
So I think we want to be remembered, we want to look back on this time, I should say, as being on the correct side of history, and that we hope to look back on this time as a pivot point. Being remembered for taking action, for doing things within our organization, and also in the community to disrupt systemic racism, and to do it in a really authentic way that is not because we want media attention or more grant money, but because it is right and just. And I guess my action item would be something that has served us so well, is really putting a lot of thought into a set of guiding principles for DEI and anti-racism work that can help you as you walk through this process of decision making.
Great. Deborah?
To make a difference. That's the critical point, to have the courage to make a difference. And what I would, because I wish we're out of time, I think people's assignments is to think, what can they do?
And Matías.
I firmly believe that institutions of culture and education are going to be the ones that are going to help society on the other side of both COVID and the continuing process of understanding inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, and the lack of it. So there needs to be a redoubling of that commitment. We need to listen more acutely. Even the questions that we got today came from a perspective, and I would urge everyone, think twice, assume that your interlocutor is well-intentioned and trying to do the right thing. So ask open-ended questions. We need to do that as a society, but I was struck by not the subject matter of the questions, but the sort of language. And look for the silver linings, have courage, and listen very, very acutely. And Jen, thanks very much for convening us today. And thank you, Deborah and Michelle.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to leave with one action item. I think as an industry, we need to really have an honest discussion about this audition process and what we can do better. So that's my action item to musicians, administrators, everybody. So thank you, everyone, for watching today, and we'll continue this conversation out in the world. Bye.
Thank you, Jen. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.
Bye.